Epic Mickey was a name I'd not heard since the PS Vita days. I had a lot of fun in the second game of that series on the Vita, though the first had eluded handhelds, being exclusive for the Nintendo Wii. However, it was recently remade for a lot of platforms, including Nintendo's hybrid console. So let's dive back into the magical and tragic world of Disney cartoons. Here is my review of Epic Mickey Rebrushed for the Nintendo Switch. The story is centered around Mickey Mouse. He happens upon a painted magical town in Yen Sid's workshop, accidentally spilling a bottle of paint thinner onto the town. Later on, he is magically dragged into that world along with Yen Sid's paintbrush, finding that his little thinner accident had created a literal monster that took over the town, a place where older Disney characters had gone to live after they were forgotten. With the magical brush in hand, Mickey decides to fight against the blob's monsters and seek a way to get back to his own world. The story of this game I find very charming. It's meta in a way, with the Mickey from that game being the one that became famous in the real world from being in so many Disney cartoons. It's constantly referencing Disney, with pretty much all of its levels being based on old cartoons and the game world itself being loosely based on Disneyland. When it comes to gameplay, Rebrushed is a 3D platformer with combat and puzzle elements. As you trek through it, you'll platform in both 3D and 2D, fighting off enemies and manipulating the world with paint and paint thinner. Since this is a remake, a few things have changed. The core experience is still there, but with the addition of some new collectibles, enemies, and abilities, costumes coming back from Epic Mickey 2, a completely reworked control scheme, and more forgiving gameplay, having less loading between dying and respawning, and many of the original game's instant death traps now doing damage instead. Let's talk about main progression and what you're going to be doing. This is a 3D platformer with some 2D levels. You get a hub town fairly early in the game with NPCs and mini quests to take on, often being getting items from someone, aka fetch quest, or taking care of some enemies that have wandered into town. In each area you'll also find projector screens that basically are how you go from one level to the next. And these locations are split between 3D and 2D. The 3D levels have you wandering around with using the main mechanic with painting, while the 2D levels are a little more interesting. All of the 2D side-scrolling levels are based on old Disney cartoons and have you just jumping and navigating hazards to get from one point to another, but everything that you see in the level is basically an old homage to those old cartoons. Getting back to the 3D levels though, navigating these locations is a matter of platforming and using the magic paintbrush to manipulate the world. It's said in the story that this whole town is made of paint and cartoon ink. The brush can use paint and thinner to fill in or erase parts of the world to help you navigate it and solve puzzles. Many hidden pathways or collectibles are behind walls, buildings, and posters, so you spray them down with thinner to take the wall away and walk into said hidden area. Or you can fill up a broken bridge to be able to walk across it. This is extended to combat as well. You'll occasionally fight blob-like enemies in the 3D levels. You can swing your paintbrush to push them back with a physical attack, but the main way of combating them is by using paint thinner to remove what makes them exist, and they'll just explode and be defeated. Speaking of combat, this is also where the game has significantly changed. On the Wii, you used motion controls with the Wiimote for aiming, painting, and doing physical attacks. But in Rebrushed, it's all been reworked to physical buttons. You can still enable gyro aiming here on the Switch or on PS5 to use motion to aim once you start painting, but it's no longer required, and that's as far as the motion controls go. This is the basic gameplay flow. You go from area to area solving puzzles, go back to the hub, do more levels, and there's some side quests thrown into all of that here and there. It works well as all of the levels are pretty short and have a fair bit of replayability in having hidden collectibles you can find and being able to unlock those levels in the hub instead of having to remember which 3D level led to the 2D one you need to go back to. The game autosaves often as well, so it's great for the Switch's portability. The only thing I would nitpick this game on is its rather slow start. The game's opening couple of hours feel like they take a long time to get through. When I got finished with the quote-unquote tutorial dungeon and the initial clock tower boss, I thought I'd gotten a large chunk of the game done, but I'd barely scratched a single part of it. Thankfully, once you reach Mean Street, your hub, and start learning about what this world is, the game vastly improves with all the Disney references and the story in general regarding Oswald and everyone that lives in the wasteland. And with that in mind, let's dive into content and length. If you focus on the story of this game and not exploration or side content, it'll probably take you around 12 to 15 hours to trek through Epic Mickey. It's not a bad amount of length and one that can easily be doubled if you do search for side content and collectibles. Next up is presentation, which unfortunately is where most of the game's issues are. Starting with visuals, they look pretty good. The models are nice, very few jagged edges around. The world does look a little dreary, but it's kinda supposed to be like that from the story. The main issues here are with performance. First, some of the loading sequences can be pretty long. Some load times are fine in the 10 to 20 second range when moving from level to level, but a few select areas can be very long. Whenever I leave the cinema to load back into Mean Street, it'll take almost a minute and a half to load me back into that hub area. Granted, there are only a few places that do this, but when they do, it's long. The second problem is occasional crashing. I had the game crash on me about 5 to 6 times across the entire game, mostly when going into the projector levels. Thankfully, the autosave is constantly going, so no progress was ever lost, but it was an issue that happened fairly often. And finally is the frame rate. This game tries to maintain 30 FPS on the Switch, but in a lot of the 3D areas, it just doesn't. From the tutorial dungeon towards the beginning, you see a lot of dips into the 20s. It's not always happening and they're not huge frame drops, but they happen a lot pretty much anywhere, especially if you're in a hub or any type of large environment. That brings us to battery life. Epic Mickey gives the original and light models a range of about 3 to 4.5 hours, while the V2 and OLED models get 5.5 to 6.5 hours. In conclusion, Epic Mickey has escaped Wii exclusivity and has also debuted in the handheld world, bringing its charming story about the long gone past of Disney animation. Now, the downside, the game isn't optimized that well, offering lots of small frame drops into the 20s, occasional crashing, and a few very lengthy loading areas. But if you can deal with the frame drops and its slow start, it's a fun little platformer that has constant references to Disney's past from before the days of Mickey Mouse. Reviews to Go rates Epic Mickey Rebrushed for the Nintendo Switch a 7 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.